Welcome to the Near Memo, a weekly conversation about search, social, and commerce. What happened, why it matters, and the implications for local. Okay, welcome to Near Memo episode 24. Woohoo, yes. Where David, Mike, and I talk about... Yes! David, Mike, and I talk about the local and non-local news of the week, things that are interesting, compelling to us in one way or another, hopefully interesting to you. Thanks for being here. And away we go, Mike Blumenthal.
So what struck me during the week was just it started with that article I wrote about the FTC, followed up by the executive order from Biden focusing on small business and workers in their sort of creating a number of executive orders across the executive branch to increase competition, everything from making hearing aids available over the counter, which Apple's going to love because AirPods are going to become hearing aids, to rolling out resuscitating from the dead the Robinson-Patman Act, which most of you are not familiar with. I was very familiar with as I got my axe kicked by Walmart in the early 90s. It was an act that was created during FDR's time that was supposed to create fairness in distribution. Cost of savings could only be accrued due to increased volume. But there were all sorts of special deals that Walmart was able to negotiate. Anyways, they're resuscitating that act in, sounds like alcohol, meat packing, grocery industry. And so it's interesting on a number of levels. There was a good article in The Guardian that sort of talked about how consolidated our food supply had become, both groceries and alcohol with Busch Anheuser, how most, Busch, I think, owns 600 brands or something of beer.
AB InBev, I believe.
And so it appears that at least in certain segments of our society, the executive branch is coalescing behind the FTC and the Justice Department in an effort to increase competition. It was unusual to see the language about, small businesses and workers, which has not been the standard language from Democrats since at least Clinton in the 90s. And it was surprising to see Biden handing the pen over to the FTC chair. So it at least on the side of the executive branch, there seems to be a commonality and pulling on the same oar, which is a critical part of this succeeding. Obviously, the judicial branch is still working under different rules, and the legislative branch has these 6 laws that have to pass. But if some of those laws pass, it would appear that this thing might have legs. And it's just shocking to me after so many years of watching the sort of decay, what Biden called the experiment of allowing large businesses free rein fail. It's shocking to see that the tides are turning.
Well, hopefully that's true. I mean, I think that, one of the big challenges is, will the agencies be able to carry out these priorities? They're not uniformly, there's often a mix of people. The FTC has 2 Republicans and 3 Democrats, who can overrule the Republicans. But there's going to be some friction in rolling this out. But I agree that it's a pretty ambitious order and pretty striking in its language and in sort of explicitness of some of that discussion. Then also we have the courts, unfortunately, that are going to block some of the things that these agencies try and do. I mean, recall the recent decision, the name escapes me, where the FTC was told it can't impose monetary damages on companies. It can only, use equitable relief, meaning injunctions, telling people to stop bad behavior. But this is a major enforcement tool that was taken away from the FTC. And, so we're going to face a hostile judiciary, lots and lots of Republican appointees who will say, oh, the agency has overreached its authority. Only Congress can do this kind of thing. So anticipate those kinds of legal challenges and those kinds of decisions. Hopefully
I don't think that the Democrats are unanimous either. There was conversation about a hearing the other day where the Democrat from California opposed most of these antitrust laws.
You talking about Feinstein?
No,
or the new senator?
I think it was in the House, where she was receiving a lot of money from tech companies. So there's a lot of conflict within the Democrats as well. I don't think it's a done deal, but I think it's fascinating that from the president and much of the executive branch, there's general agreement. The FTC has rearranged all its rules to facilitate this. And I think if a couple of those laws pass Congress, then you in some industries. And I also thought it was interesting that they were targeting farmers and agriculture and small businesses, which are groups that have historically not been democratic. And there is in this some possibility of a realignment of American politics if those groups find this of value to them, which it appears like they might. Ranchers were very smart.
People don't always act rationally, as we know from the vaccine
True,
situation.
but largely American politics aligns around economic interests of strong capitalist groups. And one could think that possibly that could happen with this, because this is going to realign who's paying for whom in Congress. Right? I mean, if the tech companies don't get what they want, they're going to shift their support someplace else and other companies will move in. I don't know. It's going to be exciting, whatever happens. And I think I was just fascinated that Biden took such aggressive stance. Didn't they?
I think it was actually after you saw your article that he wrote that executive order, right?
I was just going to say that the alcohol example with InBev is kind of interesting. So I've, just as a craft beer aficionado, I've been sort of tangentially following it, and they've bought, InBev has bought a big brewery here in Oregon, 10 Barrel, down in Bend, as well as Hop Valley and Elysian, and Ballast Point was bought by Constellation, which owns Corona. This was all 4 or 5 years ago. The interesting thing is I think that the biggest threat from an alcohol in the alcohol industry that InBev is feeling is that, okay, craft beer is simply a better product and is preferred by consumers. So it's actually not such a big deal that they're buying these sort of micro breweries. The bigger problem for consumers relative to competition and, shutting out all these craft breweries is they're also buying distributors. And alcohol being such a regulated industry, the breweries do not have the ability to go direct to consumer. I think where this may play might have the potential to set a precedent around some of the companies that we talk about on this podcast is Amazon, which does largely control distribution as well as making its own product. And so if there is a sort of tie-in to the themes that we talk about in terms of tech, I think that Amazon might be the most at risk from the analogy of increasing competition in the alcohol industry.
Well, what struck me about what you just said is that the craft breweries are the startups, the would-be competitors, and AB InBev is Google or Facebook buying the smaller startup to preempt the competition or to co-opt the company.
Right, and controlling the means of distributing that startup, essentially. Yeah,
and also getting the benefits of scale. I mean, brewing largely has benefits from massive scale to some extent. I mean, obviously, there's issues of custom and taste, but
there's only so many hops of a particular strain. So yeah, it's the scaling issue is a little harder in brewing than in other industries.
Okay, so just as my dog is starting to bark, it's my turn to talk. In fact, David, why don't you go, because she's going to be barking and hopefully she'll calm down.
She heard craft beer and got really excited.
Thanks for joining David, Mike, and Greg. To stay on top of the latest developments in local, subscribe to our newsletter at nearmedia.co. We'll see you next week.